Hello everyone, my name is Raina D. Jute and welcome to my Module 14 Confusing Concepts video. This module honestly pushed me in ways that I wasn't expecting, partly because of the features I had to build, but mostly because of the decision I had to make about how to build them. So today I have three concepts to walk through. One is pretty broad, a new paradigm for how navigation works in React Native. One is very specific, a weird counterintuitive fix I had to apply during the migration process, and one is more of a thinking concept, something about how I approached risk and decision making under a tight deadline that I think will stick with me into the future. So let's get into it. The first concept is file-based routing with Expo Router, and the core idea is this: the actual file system is the navigation system. Before this module, I was using React Navigation, which is the more traditional approach for React Native apps. With React Navigation, you define your routes in JavaScript, you create navigator objects, you name your screens in code, and you wire them together manually. The file where a screen component lives has nothing to do with where it shows up in the actual navigation tree. They're two totally separate things. Expo Router flips that completely. So in Expo Router, the physical location of a file inside of the app directory determines what route it becomes. So you don't define routes in code, you just create files and the router reads the folder structure and builds the navigation from it automatically. So here is my app directory. It is all this right here. You can see app and then layout.js, which is the root layout that wraps everything. Then we've got app auth, which is the login screen, and it has its own layout. Then we've got restaurants, this auth, and app in parentheses. These are called route groups. The parentheses mean that the folder name doesn't appear in the URL path. It's just for organizational purposes. A way to group related routes together and apply a shared layout to them without changing the actual route. The restaurant ID with the square brackets is a dynamic route. So instead of having one file per restaurant, I have one file that matches any route with an ID that's in position. The ID gets passed as a parameter that I can read with use local search params. And then the layout.js files, every time you have a layout.js in a folder, it becomes a wrapper for everything inside of that folder. So app tabs layout.js wraps all the tab screens in the tab navigator. I define the tabs there, and any file in that folder automatically becomes a tab. What took me a while to fully understand is that the nesting of the file is the nesting of the navigation. 3 levels of nesting in my folder structure: root layout, then app group, then tabs group, map directly to 3 levels of nesting in the actual app. And I didn't have to write a single line of code to actually wire that up. So if we look at the tab layout, so this file just defines what the tabs look like. So it's got the screen options, the tab bar label style, the icons, and the header bar. Then any route file placed inside of this tabs folder becomes a tab automatically. The restaurant tab, the order history tab, the account tab, they exist because the files exist in the right place. That's it. The mental model shift for me was learning to think about navigation spatially as a folder structure instead of as a code graph I had to manually define. Once it clicked, building the Courier app's parallel tab structure was actually really fast. Because I already knew the pattern, I just kind of mirrored their folder structure throughout. The second concept I have is NavigationContainer independent true as a migration bridge. This one is a very specific concept, and honestly it's a little nerdy, but it's the moment during this module that made me go, wait, I think I actually know what's happening here. So when I migrated from React Navigation to Expo Router, I did it in phases. The idea was phase 1, install the Expo Router and get it booting, but keep the old navigation app still running underneath while I proved that the new wiring system was working. Once the foundation was stable, I'd rebuild the navigation layer properly. The problem is both Expo Router and React Navigation need a navigation container at the root, and React Navigation has a rule: you can't nest a navigation container inside of another one. If you do, you get an error. Expo Router sets up its own container automatically at the framework level. So when my old app navigator also tried to mount a navigation container, it just crashed and crashed and crashed. The fix was one single prop, independent equals true, on my old navigation container. So what does independent equals true actually do? It tells React Native to treat this navigation container as a completely separate navigation tree, one that doesn't try to register itself or coordinate with any other parent container. Normally, nested containers try to share state, which causes a lot of conflicts, but with independent equals true, they coexist without talking to each other. The reason this works as a temporary bridge is that during phase 1, nothing in the app actually needed the two navigation systems to talk to each other. Expo Router was just rendering the old app as a pass-through, a slot that delegated everything to React Navigation. So there was no cross-system navigation calls and no shared route state. Two parallel trees coexisting but ignoring each other. But equals, and this is the important part, is not something you'd ever ship. It means you have two completely isolated navigation contexts, which breaks things like deep linking, hardware, back button handling, and URL-based routing across the whole app. It's a bridge, not a solution. So the moment phase 2 was done and I deleted the old app navigator, that prop went with it. What I find conceptually interesting about this is that it illustrates something that I've been learning more generally. Sometimes the right solution to a complex problem is a temporary bad solution that creates enough stability to build the real thing. You accept a known limitation for a short window, you use it, move forward, and then you remove it deliberately. That's different from just leaving a workaround in the code and just hoping that nobody notices, which guilty. And this is one of those more theoretical concepts because I have deleted that file from my project, so I can't really show you, but it's independent equals true inside of curly braces. Concept number 3 is managing a risky migration against a deadline. So the third concept is less about a specific piece of code and more about a way of thinking that this module forced me to develop. And it's this: how do you make a good decision when you're doing something risky with limited time and you're not sure if it'll work or how to make it work? So that's the situation that I was in this week. The grading sheet for this module was written in Expo Router conventions, specific file names, specific folder structures. My project was built on React Navigation, so Coach ET said it wasn't strictly required to switch, but that the Expo Router was strongly encouraged, and I had to have this submitted by the normal Friday deadline. So the question was, do I attempt the migration or do I stay on React Navigation and accept the risk of losing a few points? So what I've learned is that this kind of decision has a sort of structure to it, and you can think through it more clearly if you name the pieces specifically. So first, what does success look like and what does failure look like? Success is the migration works, the app runs on Expo Router, the checklist file names match. Failure is I break a working app, spend 2 days debugging, and submit late or don't submit at all with regressions in the features that were already working. And I need to be honest with myself that both outcomes are possible before I commit to one. Second, can I make the failure mode safe? So this is where the branching strategy became really important. I didn't attempt the migration on a main development branch. I cut a dedicated spike branch off of dev. That meant my working dev branch was untouched. If the migration went badly, abandoning it meant deleting a branch, not reverting an entire week's worth of work. The cost of failure dropped dramatically just by choosing a different branch to work on. Third is, when will I know to stop? So before I started, I set a turn back condition. Not I'll keep going until it's done. That's how I would end up in a sunk cost spiral, 5 hours deep in a broken migration, telling myself I can't stop now. So I decided if the auth gate isn't working and passing its test by a specific time, I stop and I ship React Navigation. Picking the turn back point before I was emotionally invested in the work was what made it possible to actually use it. And as it turned out, the migration worked, but not smoothly. So there were 3 separate debugging moments I hadn't anticipated. One is a Babel resolution bug where a wrong Babel preset expo was being loaded from a sibling project, a React Navigation container conflict that required that independent equals true bridge, and a white screen after phase 3 that turned out to be a missing expo font dependency. Any one of those could have been my turn back point if I hadn't been able to diagnose and fix it quickly. What made the difference is not that I'm a wonderful debugger. I'm only 4 months in, so I really don't know that much. But what made the difference was that at each point I asked what's actually happening here before I tried to fix anything. Not let me try a few things and see what happens. The Babel resolution bug is a good example. So the symptom was a cryptic Expo Router app root error, which could have meant 100 different things. But by reading the error, tracing the module resolution, and finding the actual path that Node was using to resolve the preset, the cause became obvious. And once the cause was obvious, the fix was one line in package JSON. I think the broader principle is a diagnosis that you do understand is worth more than a fix that you don't. Because when the next weird things break, and in a migration there's always a next weird thing, you have a mental model that you can actually reason from. So those are my 3 concepts for Module 14. File-based routing, understanding that the file system is the navigation map, and that Expo Router reads your folder structure to build the navigation automatically rather than writing it by hand. The independent equals true bridge, a very specific temporary trick that lets 2 navigation systems coexist during a migration without conflict, and why it's only safe to use it for exactly as long as you need it. And then the decision-making framework for risky work, branching safely, set a turn-back condition before you start, and diagnose before you fix. This module honestly changed how I think about development more than any of the features that I actually built. I definitely had some moments where I was beating my head against a wall and couldn't figure out. Actually, during my tech demo video, the whole thing stopped working, and I was like, here we go again. So those are my 3 concepts. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.